Welcome to the second season of the Leading Cultural Forum. I'm Robert Langston. Katie Newell, who was going to give the introduction, unfortunately injured herself sitting up the tables and won't be here, but I am instead. And welcome to the Milwaukee High School's Black Box Theater. This is our first year here, and it's certainly more spacious and comfortable than the Pond House was. Next, for 2014 this year, we have a great lineup of speakers. March 6th will be Peter Ames Carlin, author of Brian Wilson and Paul McCartney, and he will read from his latest book, a biography of Bruce Springsteen entitled The Boss. Oh, Bruce, not The Boss. Correction on that. And you can find other schedules out in the lobby of our upcoming events. This project is funded in part by the Friends of the Leading Library and a grant from the Clackamas Cultural Coalition and the Oregon Cultural Trust. And we thank them for their support and for making this sort of program possible. Thanks also to Jill Younce, and the Painted Lady, who usually has cookies here, but unfortunately, because we had to reschedule Monday night, she was not able to bring cookies and coffee for tonight. But we do have cookies out in the lobby, courtesy of Fred Myers. And feel free to eat the cookies, but keep them out there. They don't want cookies and food in here except for Mr. Margolin's water. There's also a survey form which you've been handed out. We would really appreciate if you would fill those out and then hand them back, because it gives us good feedback, lets us know what we're doing right, what we can improve, and makes our programs just that much stronger down the road. And also, turn off your cell phones. Your cell phones. Yeah. That's okay. I can't talk. Phillip Margolin grew up in New York City and Levittown. He was a voracious reader, and by the time he was 12, he knew he wanted to be a lawyer. After earning a bachelor's degree at American University in Washington, D.C., he did a 2-year stint with the Peace Corps in Liberia, and when he returned, he entered New York University School of Law as a night student. During the day, he worked as a junior high school teacher in the South Bronx to pay for law school. But he also had an itch to write, and during his last year of law school, Margolin wrote Heartstone, which was published in 1978 and nominated for an Edgar Award. He quit writing to concentrate on his law practice, and for 25 years was a criminal defense attorney at the trial and appellate levels. As an appellate attorney, he has appeared before the United States Supreme Court, the United States Court of Appeals, the Ninth Circuit, the Oregon Supreme Court, and the Oregon Court of Appeals. Phil Margolin was the first Oregon attorney to use battered women's syndrome to defend a woman accused of murdering her spouse. He never really quit writing, and in 1993, Gone But Not Forgotten was published and became a mega hit, was sold to more than 25 foreign publishers, and was made into a miniseries. In 2004, After Dark, The Burning Man, The Undertaker's Widow, Wild Justice, The Associate, Ties That Bind, and Sleeping Beauty were also New York Times booksellers. And there were also selections and main selections of the major book clubs. A recurring theme in his fast-paced, well-plotted novels is a concern for the underclass, the victims of racism, and social injustice. Please welcome Phillip Margolin, and if you can keep your questions until after he's finished with this program, he'll be happy to answer them.
So I've written, just going to try to get this out first. So Worthy Brown's Daughter is my 19th novel. I wrote one book with my daughter, which was for 8 to 12-year-olds, but the other 17, they were all on the New York Times bestseller list, and they all had something in common in that they are contemporary. They're all legal thrillers that are set in the present, mostly in Oregon. Worthy Brown is a huge departure for a number of reasons. The biggest, of course, is that it is set in 1860, and it's another departure because it took me 30 years to write it. So that's another thing that's a little bit different from some of the other books. And so what I wanted to do tonight was to tell you what inspired me to write Worthy Brown, and about some of the research I did. And then I love questions, because I am the first published author I ever met. And I didn't meet me as a published author until I was in my 30s, So I would have liked to have the opportunity to ask somebody who'd actually done this, how do you do this? I didn't have, I had one writing class in my whole life. I got a C plus my sophomore year in college. So really just wandering around in the wilderness trying to figure out how to write the books. As you heard, I've had 2 books made into movies, so when we're all done, if you want to ask about movies or publishing or writing process, anything you're interested in, I'd love to answer the questions. My attorney has told me I can't answer any questions about the rumors about me and Lindsay Lohan, but other than that, everything's sort of fair game. So as you heard, when I was about 12 years old, 7th grade, as a result of overdose of Perry Mason books, I decided I was going to be a criminal defense lawyer when I grew up. And from that point on, that was the only career I ever wanted to have. I didn't want to be a lawyer. I wanted to be a criminal defense lawyer and do murder cases like Perry did. Now, as far as the writing goes, though, it literally never entered my mind that I would someday write a book. I mean, I've heard a lot of authors that speak and they say, oh, I knew I wanted to be a writer from the time I was 1 year old. That wasn't me. And there's a reason for that. I've been a voracious reader since elementary school. I still read like 1 to 3 books a week. And I was in awe of writers, and it just never occurred to me that I could write something that somebody would publish. So it was off my radar. And I didn't get involved in my last semester in law school. As you heard, I worked my way through teaching junior high in the South Bronx. So between full-time teaching and then going at night and taking a full law school course, I had enough time to eat and breathe, and that was about it. But then really something wonderful happened my last semester. To get through in 3 years like the day students, I took summer classes. And my last semester, I had a job waiting for me in Oregon, clerking for the chief judge of the Oregon Court of Appeals. So since I had a job, I just had to get D's in my classes to get out. And my wife had graduated from college, and she had a job, so I didn't have to work that summer because she could pay the rent. So for the first time since maybe the 7th grade, I had a summer where I wasn't working, and I tried to figure out what should I do with myself. And I decided I was going to try to solve one of life's great mysteries, and that is, how do those guys fill up 400 pages with words? And I don't know if you've ever thought about it, but I would open these big books and I'd think, how did this guy think of all this stuff? So my project for the summer was to try to write a novel based on my 2 years in the Peace Corps, not to get published or because I felt I had something I wanted to tell the world. I just wanted to see, could I write more than 25 pages about something? And I spent 2 years working on this book. It was 187 pages, so I was very proud of myself because it was more than 25. But one of the things you learn in law school is to be completely unemotional and objective about your cases. And reading the book unemotionally and objectively, I realized it wasn't very good. So I didn't try to get it published or anything, but the thing I liked is I really enjoyed the writing process, creating this three-dimensional world where everything goes exactly the way you want it, unlike real life. So, when I was in court, the judge would say, well, Mr. Margolin, I read your motion, and I'm going to deny it and sentence your client to die. And you have to say, well, thank you, Your Honor, thank you, Your Honor. But then you could go home and write a chapter where the judge does that, and a samurai comes out from behind the thing, and he cuts his head off, and blood spurts out of his neck, and he dies horribly. So if you're a writer, you don't have to go into therapy or take antidepressants. You can get rid of all your anger and angst while you're writing. So I really like this idea of having this control over this environment, creating this three-dimensional world. So I wrote a second book, which was even worse than the first one, and every once in a while I would send out some short stories, and they were all rejected. And then in my 30s, after I'd been practicing law for a while, I sold a short story to a national magazine. I got $65. I was very excited about that. And what I got out of this was self-confidence, because I honestly had no confidence that I could write publishable material, something that, a major publisher would want to publish. But this was sort of validation. So I decided that I would take a shot at writing a serious novel. And I had come across the Payton Allen murder case. How many of you have heard of Payton Allen? A couple. It was in the murders, I think, happened in the late 50s, and it was in the courts for about 20 years. And in my opinion, and I've done 30 homicides myself and read, some of the true crime stuff like Helter Skelter. I don't think there's ever been a more complex or amazing murder case than Payton Allen. And I had this little gem all to myself, and I decided I was going to write a heavily fictionalized version of it. And through a series of events, it was published in 1978. In 1981, I wrote my second novel, The Last Innocent Man. That was published. But then I quit for 12 years. And the reason I quit was, if you remember, my real passion, thing I was really excited about was criminal defense. And the same year that Heartstone came out, I also argued in the U.S. Supreme Court. And in between the two books, I started doing major murder cases and big appeals. So the stuff I'd wanted to do since I was a kid, I was starting to do. And so I decided I just put the writing on the back burner. So it's now the early 1980s. And I don't remember how I found out about Holmes versus Ford. But I think it was probably an article in the Oregon Historical Society Journal, but it could have been someplace else. And this Holmes versus Ford is an 1853 case from the Oregon Territory, and it is the only Oregon case dealing with slavery. And we had slaves in the Oregon Territories. We had slaves in the 1850s and 1840s, and people don't know about this. Just as a footnote, if I pique your interest about this, there's a wonderful book by Greg Noakes that was published last year. It's been nominated for an Oregon Book Award, and it was also picked by the Oregonian as one of the 10 best books of the year. It's called Breaking Chains. And coincidentally, and I didn't realize this was going on, but Greg was at a book talk that I gave out in Sun River about 2 years ago, and after the talk I took questions, and someone asked me, what's your next project? And I mentioned Worthy Brown and said it was inspired by Holmes v. Ford, and he came up afterwards and said, I just finished a book that's coming out in a couple of months, and it's about the Holmes versus Ford case. It's a nonfiction book, so it's really good too. I've read it, and if you're really interested in finding out about slavery in Oregon, I found it really fascinating. So anyway, I found out about this Holmes versus Ford case, and it was just a heartbreaking case. It was just so sad. In 1840s, Colonel Nathaniel Ford owned a family of slaves. He owned more than one family. He owned a lot of slaves in Missouri. And the economy tanked in Missouri, so he decided to come to Oregon and start over. And he told Robin and Polly Holmes, who were the mother and father of a family of slaves, that if they would come with him to Oregon and help him set up a farm, and it's now what is Rick Reel, that's where his property was, that he would free them. So the mother and father and their 5 children went to Oregon. The alternative was that he was going to sell them in Missouri. So they just decided they would come and seek their freedom in Oregon, where slavery was illegal in the territory. So when they got there, they kept their part of the bargain, but Ford reneged in part. And what he did was he set Robin and Polly, the mother and father, free, and with one small child, but there were 4 other children that he kept. And he told Robin and Polly that he had put money into these kids when they were too young to be a benefit to them, but now he wanted to get his money back, and they were old enough to work at his, on the farm, and so he was going to keep them. Well, Oregon was very racist in, I mean, now everybody thinks we're, blue state where everyone's drinking lattes all day. But back in the 1840s, this was a very racist state. And we were the only state in the Union to have an exclusion clause in our Constitution. It's, Article 1, Section 35 said that no free Negro not living in Oregon when the Constitution was passed could live here or own property or make contracts or bring lawsuits. So Robin and Polly, who were illiterate because they were slaves, they weren't allowed to be educated, so illiterate and uneducated, had to find a white lawyer to try to get their children back. And in this climate of very racist attitudes, it wasn't easy. And the judges they did finally find Reuben Boyce, who eventually got on the Oregon Supreme Court, agreed to help them. But the judges didn't want to hear the case because Nathaniel Ford had become a powerful politician. He is, in fact, the first Oregon judge, although he didn't accept the post. He was supposed to be the first judge in the territory, and if you look in the Blue Book, I guess it has him listed, but he never took the part. But he was in the legislature, so they didn't want to rule on the case. And then finally, in 1853, because we were a territory, the judges were appointed from Washington, and George Williams, a New Yorker, I believe, was appointed to be the Chief Justice of the Oregon Territorial Court. And he didn't know anyone here, and within a week of his coming, he ruled in the case that Ford had to give the kids back. But by that time, one of them had died. And I just thought that this was the most heartbreaking situation. Here are these people who are having their children stolen from them and they can't get them back because of their skin color, and then to have one of them die before they were able to actually get them back. So I was thinking that this would be really an interesting idea for a fictional book. I didn't want to write nonfiction, but I wanted to write something inspired by this horrible situation. And so I decided this was going to be a project I was going to work on, but I had a couple of problems. The first problem was that this book was, I moved it up to 1860, the second year of statehood, from the 1840s, and I made Worthy Brown the father and his 15-year-old daughter Roxanne instead of having a whole family. So when the fictional version, I cut down the family. But my big problem was that I'd only had one history class in college, and I wasn't particularly interested in history. And that history class had nothing to do with Oregon in 1860. So I was saying, well, if you have to make your books realistic, I didn't know what would you do if you want to get a glass of water. Did they have faucets? Did you brush your teeth? Was there toothpaste? I mean, I didn't know anything at all about this period. Well, fortunately, the Oregon Historical Society has a great library, and it was only a couple blocks from my office. And the Multnomah County Library was also very close to my office. So when my practice wasn't too busy, if I had a free couple hours in the afternoon, I would wander over to the Oregon Historical Society. I spent about 6 years off and on there, reading journals of people who'd come on the Oregon Trail, books about the period, anything I could get my hands on that would give me some feel for what it would be like to live in Oregon in that time period. And then in addition, I had another problem because there are three main characters in the book. One is Worthy Brown, the second one is his daughter Roxanne, but the third is Matthew Penny, and he is this young white lawyer who's come from Ohio with his wife, looking for a better life in Oregon, and his wife dies on the Oregon Trail. She drowns. And so by the time he gets to Oregon, he's grieving, he's very depressed. His law practice really isn't going very well. And he is the person that Worthy finds who's willing to sue Caleb Barber, a very powerful Oregon lawyer who has brought Worthy and Roxanne from Georgia, and I changed it from Missouri to Georgia. So I have a main character who's an attorney. Well, what was it like to practice law in 1860? You know, you didn't have any emails or cell phones or PDAs or whatever. I mean, what did you do? How did you practice law? So that was my second task, not only find out what it was like to live in 1860, but what was it like to be a lawyer then? Well, I fortuitously stumbled across the memoirs of a person who I consider to be one of the most interesting people in the history of the United States, and is somebody nobody knows about. And I'm going to ask you if anyone here does know who this person is, but if you don't feel bad. I've had one, I think maybe three people. I've been on tour since January 21st, and I've had maybe three people who knew this person, and to especially don't feel bad, because the first time I talked about Worthy Brown was as the keynote speaker at the dinner or the gala event for the Federal District Court Historical Society. There were about 200 people in this ballroom at the Governor Hotel, and I said, who, because these are all law people, and it's history law people, and I think like one or two people raised their hands that they knew who it was. So here's the question. Who knows who Stephen J. Field is? Okay, so who is he? First of all, he was the first United States Supreme Court Justice from the West. Abraham Lincoln appointed him. Secondly, he was the longest serving until William O. Douglas. But most interesting to me as a writer is that he's the only United States Supreme Court Justice who was arrested for murder while he was sitting on the bench. He moved from New York. To California and practiced in Marysville. And how many of you have seen the old Maverick show? Well, his life reads like some episode of Maverick. He had shootouts. He had, I mean, all sorts of bizarre stuff, and including this murder case. But just to give you a little bit of an idea, and then about how different law is or was back in the 1850s from the way it's practiced today. How did he get on the California Supreme Court before he was elevated to U.S. Supreme Court? Well, David Terry, who was the Chief Justice of the California Supreme Court, was crazy, and he fought a duel to the death with a U.S. senator and killed the senator, so dueling was illegal, so he had to get off the court, and that's how Field got on. What I'm going to do is, it was interesting, when I was reading through this memoir, I found a chapter that paralleled something that happened to me when I was practicing law. So to show you how different law was in the 1850s and in the 20th century, I retired in '96, so I'm going to tell you a little bit about my situation, and then I'm going to read the similar situation, and you'll be able to see that there are differences in the way it was handled in 1850 in the Wild Wild West and the way we did it in the civilized West of the 20th century. So there was a period of time in Oregon when if you were arrested for driving under the influence and the police officer gave you a ticket, if you checked the wrong box, your case had to be dismissed. It was a loophole, and they eventually solved the problem by redesigning the ticket or something. So I had a client who came to me, and he lived in Portland and had been arrested in another county where I usually did not practice, and given a drunk driving ticket. And I looked at it, I said, oh, they didn't check the right box. You stay up here, I'll go down to the first court appearance and move to dismiss this case. And I didn't want him to come down, because if he came down, he could be reserved. So I drove down, and this was a judge I'd never heard of before in a county where I hardly ever practiced. And I got some sort of hint that things were not going to go well when the case was called, and I stood up and said, I'm Phillip Margolin representing blah, blah. And he said, well, where is your client? And I said, well, Your Honor, I'm going to move to dismiss this case because the ticket was faulty. And so I told my client not to come down. And he said, well, I don't know how you do things in Portland, but, and started to read me the Riot Act. So I said, well, Your Honor, I said, I'm still moving to dismiss. And he just got furious, and he turned to the DA and he says, is he right? Is he right? And the DA said, yeah, he's 100% correct. And then he turned to me, he says, well, Mr. Marley, he says, if you persist on, insist on moving to dismiss this case, I am going to order the district attorney to send a police officer up to Portland and reserve your client, and he's going to have to pay all the expenses. That's totally illegal. I mean, it's not even, I mean, it's off the charts illegal. But I said, well, Your Honor, I said, I'm still going to move to dismiss the case, and eventually he had to dismiss it. Well, my concern was, I was pretty self-confident, I had a lot of experience as a lawyer, but I was thinking, what if I had been a young lawyer, first year in practice, who practiced in front of this judge in this county all the time, would I have knuckled under? Would I have sold my client out? Because it would have been pretty intimidating. So I went to the clerk's office, and I got a copy of the tape to make sure I heard what I'd heard. And I listened to it, and by golly, everything I thought I heard, I did hear. And then I thought, well, maybe this guy's just having a bad day. You know, I don't want to ruin his career if maybe he had a fight with his wife, or he went to the doctor and got some horrible diagnosis. So I'm going to check. So this is what I did. I called up a number of lawyers where he practiced, and I told them what had happened, and I said, you know, is he always like this? He said, yeah, he's a jackass. He says, the guy's terrible. He's always rude to people and mean to people, and they just, you know, went on and on about how awful he is. So this is how I handled it. I sent the tape. I wrote down an account of everything that had happened, and then enclosed the tape and sent it to the Judicial Fitness Committee, and eventually he had to write a letter apologizing to me. So, okay, so that's how this conflict with the judge was handled in the 20th century. So now I'm going to read you a short section from Field's memoirs, and you will notice certain differences between the way people settle matters in the courts in the 1850s. The Turner controversy. Towards the end of May 1850, William Turner, who had been appointed judge of the 8th Judicial District of the state by the first legislature, which convened under the Constitution, made his appearance and announced that he intended to open the district court at Marysville on the first Monday of the next month. Well, we were all pleased with the prospect of having a regular court, and endeavored as far as lay in our power to make the stay of the judge with us agreeable. I had been in the habit of receiving a package of New York newspapers by every steamer, and among them came copies of the New York Evening Post, which was at that time the organ of the so-called Free Soil Party. When Judge Turner arrived, I waited on him to pay my respects and sent him the various newspapers I had received. Now, he had lived for years in Texas, and as it proved, was a man of narrow mind and bitter prejudices. And he seems to have had a special prejudice against New Yorkers, and regarded a free soiler as an abomination. I've also been told, and I believe such to be the fact, that my sending him these newspapers, and particularly the Evening Post, led him to believe that I was an abolitionist, a person held in special abhorrence in those days by gentlemen from the South. But at any rate, he conceived a violent dislike for me, which was destined in a short time to show itself and cause me great annoyance. What was intended on my part as an act of courtesy turned out to be the beginning of a long, bitter, and on his part, ferocious quarrel. Well, Field decides that he wants to go back east. His family is still in New York, and he had made plans to do that. But Captain Sutter, who was a very influential person in Marysville, where Field practiced, asked him if he would represent him in a suit that was filed against Sutter by a man named Cameron. Field tries to beg off, but Sutter is a friend, and he finally says, well, okay, I'll put off my trip, but I'm not going to be lead counsel. I'll just second chair it and help out the lead counsel. Soon after the opening of the court, sometime during the first week, the case of Captain Sutter was called, and a preliminary motion made by his attorney was decided against him. Mr. Jesse L. Goodwin, a member of the bar sitting near, said to me that the Practice Act passed at the recent session of the legislature contained a section bearing upon the question, and at the same time handed me the act. I immediately rose and, addressing the court, remarked that I was informed there was a statutory provision applicable to the point and begged permission to read it, and commenced turning over the pages of the act in search of it, when Judge Turner addressed me and, apparently irritated, said in a petulant manner, "The court knows the law. The mind of the court is made up. Take your seat, sir." Well, I was amazed at hearing such language, but in a respectful and quiet manner, stated that I accepted to the decision and would appeal from the order. The judge instantly replied in a loud and boisterous manner, "Fine that gentleman $200. I replied quietly, "Very well," or "Well, sir," and he immediately added in an angry tone, "I fine him $300 and commit him to the custody of the sheriff for 8 hours. I again replied, "Very well," and he instantly exclaimed in the same violent manner, "I fine him $400 and commit him for 12 hours. I then said that it was my right by statute to appeal from any order of his honor, and upon my statement, he flew into a perfect rage and in a loud and boisterous tone cried out, "I fine him $500 and commit him 24 hours, 48 hours, turn him out of the court," and I left the courtroom. I remained in my office for the remainder of the day and wrote out a full statement of everything that had happened, just like I wrote out a statement of what happened to me in court, and had it verified by a number of persons who were eye and ear witnesses of the affair, and sued out a writ of habeas corpus returnable before Henry P. Hawn, the county judge. The writ was executed forthwith, and the same evening I was taken before the judge, Judge Hawn. I was, of course, at once discharged, but the matter did not end there. An excited crowd was present, and as I left the courtroom, they cheered enthusiastically. I thereupon invited them to the Covillard House, a public house in the town, and directed the keeper to dispense to them the good things of his bar. The champagne was accordingly uncorked without stint, and the best Havana boxes were soon emptied of their most fragrant cigars. And whilst the boys were thus enjoying themselves, Judge Turner entered the Covillard House, perfectly furious, and applied obscene and vile epithets to the county judge, declaring with an oath that he would teach that fellow that he was an inferior judge and that the witnesses before him were a set of perjured scoundrels who should be expelled from the bar. Similar threats were made by him in different saloons in the town, to the disgust of everyone, and that evening was burned in effigy in the plaza. It gets better. This is just the preliminary stuff. On Monday following, June 10th, which was the first day in which the court was held after the scenes narrated, Judge Turner ordered that Judge Hawn be fined $50 and imprisoned 48 hours for his judicial acts in discharging me. At the same time, he ordered that I should be re-imprisoned and that Mr. Mulford, Mr. Goodwin, and myself should be expelled from the bar, myself for suing out the writ and those two gentlemen for being witnesses on its return, under the pretense that we had vilified the court and denounced its proceedings. Judge Hawn paid his fine and left the courtroom, and I was again taken into custody. Immediately after, I sued out another writ of habeas corpus, and whilst before the court arguing for my discharge under the writ, the sheriff entered and declared his intention of taking me out of the room and taking Judge Hawn from the bench and putting us in confinement pursuant to the order of Judge Turner. Now, Judge Hawn told the sheriff that the Court of Sessions was holding its regular term and that he was violating the law and the court must not be disturbed in its proceedings. Judge Turner immediately ordered a posse to be summoned and directed the sheriff to take Judge Hawn and myself into custody by force. Soon afterward, the sheriff with a posse entered the room of the Court of Sessions and was proceeding to seize Judge Horn on the bench when the judge stepped to a closet and drew from it a Navy revolver, cocked it, and pointing it towards the sheriff, informed him in a stern manner that he was violating the law, that whilst on the bench, he, the judge, could not be arrested, and that if the sheriff attempted to do so, he would kill him. The courtroom was immediately cleared. Judge Horn then laid the revolver on a drawer before him and inquired if there was any business ready. If so, the court would hear it, but there being none, the court adjourned. Now, when Turner caused the names of Mulford, Goodwin, and myself to be stricken from the roll of attorneys, we, of course, could no longer appear as counsel in his court. So I at once prepared the necessary papers and applied to the Supreme Court of the state for a mandamus to compel him to vacate the order and reinstate us, and the Supreme Court issues those orders. When the order for our restoration came down from the Supreme Court, Turner refused to obey it and wrote a scurrilous address to the public about us, which he published in one of the newspapers. And Judge Turner threatened violence and gave out that he intended to insult me in public the first time we met, and that if I resented his conduct, he would shoot me down on the spot. This being reported to me by various persons, I went to San Francisco and consulted Judge Bennett, like I consulted other lawyers in the town. So here's the advice that Stephen J. Field received from a judge about what to do in this case. Judge Bennett asked if I was certain that Turner had made such a threat, and I replied I was. Well, said the judge, I won't give you any advice, but if it were my case, I think I should get a shotgun and stand on the street and see that I had the first shot. I replied I could not do that I would only act in self-defense, and he replied that would be acting in self-defense. When I came to California, I came with all those notions of respect to acts of violence which are instilled into New England youth. If a man were rude, I would turn away from him. But I soon found that men in California were likely to take very great liberties with a person who acted in such a manner, and that the only way to get along was to hold every man responsible and resent every trespass upon one's rights. Though I was not prepared to follow Judge Bennett's suggestion, I did purchase a pair of revolvers and had a sack coat made with the pockets in which these barrels could lie and be discharged, and I began to practice firing the pistols from the pockets, and in time I acquired considerable skill and was able to hit a small object across the street. Having determined neither to seek Turner nor shun him, I asked a friend to carry a message to him. To make sure that it would reach him, I told different parties what I had sent. And I was confident that they would repeat it to him. Tell him from me, I said, that I don't want any collision with him, that I desire to avoid all personal difficulties, but I shall not attempt to avoid him. I shall not cross the street on his account, nor go a step out of my way for him, that I've heard his threats, and that if he attacks me or comes at me in a threatening manner, I will kill him. As it turned out, however, he never interfered with me, perhaps because he knew I was armed and believed that if I were attacked, somebody, or perhaps more than one, would be badly hurt. So, that is, there are some slight differences you may have noticed between the way things were handled in the 20th century and the way they were handled in the 1850s. And in fact, if you were a judge or a lawyer, you had to not only know the law, but you had to know how to shoot. How many of you have heard of the circuit court? Okay, why do we call it that? Because the justices of there were 4 justices of the Oregon Supreme Court, and when they would sit as appellate judges for part of the year, and then they would get on a horse, and they would ride in a circuit from town to town hearing cases. And you had to sleep outside, you had to know how to fight off bandits and wild animals. No Motel 6s. Where did you stay? You would stay in a frontier cabin. You would pay somebody to sleep in their bed when you were there, and it wasn't unusual to have 2 opposing counsel sleeping in the same bed. No courthouses, by the way, in Oregon in 1860. The cases, law cases were heard in the Coleman Barrel Company. They would clear off the loft and set up chairs, or in towns in the summer, it could be outside in a field or inside in a tavern. So it was quite different from the way law is practiced here. So why did it take me 30 years to write this book? Well, it took me about 6 or 7 years to get a first draft. And unfortunately, I had decided I wanted to write a really serious literary novel. And unfortunately, I've been reading a lot of Russians, and I decided that serious literary novels, everyone either died or was miserable at the end. So I had two main characters in my early drafts. One of them commits suicide, and the other one has lost his wife but finds new love, but is so depressed he gives her up and wanders aimlessly around America in a funk. So I sent this book, my first draft, after about 6 or 7 years, to my agent in New York, and she read it and she said, "This is a horrible book." She says, "I'm not going to send this to a publisher, it's awful." So I wasn't, writing then, I was practicing law, and I was a little bit disappointed, but I stuck it in a drawer. And about 10 years, well, in 1993, I wrote Gone But Not Forgotten. That became a huge hit. It was on the New York Times list for 10 weeks, and from that, it was, New York Times bestseller. And so at that point, I started writing contemporary legal thrillers. And at a certain point, I had finished the book about 6 months ahead of schedule, and had some free time, and I decided to dust off my historical novel, which I loved. I loved the idea of this book. And so I realized there were a lot of problems with it, because I now had about 6 or 7 New York Times bestsellers under my belt. Rewrote it again, but didn't really change a lot of the main stuff, and I sent it in to my agent, and she said, "This is a horrible book. It's very depressing. I'm not going to send this to the publisher." So, and she might have been able to sell it then, because by that time I was a fairly prominent writer, but she fortunately is a very good agent. Good agents don't do what you think you might like, they do what's best for you. And that would have probably ruined my career. So I put it away, and then in 2010, my agent's daughter was now in the agency, and she is not only a crackerjack agent, but she's a fabulous editor. And she had never seen this book, and again, same thing happened. I had finished the book way, way ahead of deadline, so I dusted off the historical novel, rewrote it a little bit, sent it in to her, and she said, "This is a terrible book." She says, "There's no story." She says, it's depressing. Everybody you might like in the book either dies or it's awful. So every woman, there's nothing here. It's awful. So, but we also had a really long talk about what I might do to make the book better. And then I had what is the most exciting thing for an author. I had an epiphany. And this happens, you're stuck, you don't know what to do, and lightning strikes your brain. And all of a sudden, oh my God, if I do this, this, and this, I'll turn this awful book into a really good book. So I took the book back and I rewrote it from page 1, completely changed it. It's nothing, it's sort of at parts like what the original was, but it's a major overhaul. The biggest thing is that everybody's happy at the end. There's a surprise ending in the middle of a murder trial, and there's all sorts of cool stuff that was not in the original drafts. So I sent it back after I did my rewrite, and I went to New York for the International Thriller Writers Conference, and I always have dinner at least once with my agent when I'm back in New York, because they're really, I don't consider them agent, consider them friends who happen to do business for me. They're really great people. And Jean she's Egyptian, but she has a British accent. And at the end of the dinner, because I was going to meet with Claire Wachtel, my editor at HarperCollins, to go over, talk about the book I was working on for Harper. And she said, "Oh, by the way, when you meet with Claire tomorrow, tell her that I'm going to be sending her an historical novel you wrote." And I almost burst into tears, because after 30 years, finally, she thought it was good enough, and then Harper loved it, and they published it, and it's got the world's best cover. I love the cover and stuff. So that is why it took me 30 years to write the book. But now I'd love to take questions. Like I said, I've had movies made. If you want to ask movies, anything about writing process, anything that's of interest to you is of interest to me, because like I said, I would love to have had the chance to ask these questions. I worked my way through law school teaching junior high in the South Bronx. So and I've taught at various other times. I taught, my main job in the Peace Corps wasn't teaching, but I did teach night school, English night school, and I've taught at law school, legal writing, I've taught creative writing, so I like teaching, it's sort of fun. Yes? I'm not going to say where it was. No, it wasn't Multnomah, because that's where I practice most of the time. Any? Yeah.
Two questions that have nothing to do with the book.
Okay, first one's free, second one's $1.25.
What made you come to Oregon?
Uh-huh.
When did you leave Levittown?
Okay, so for those of you who didn't hear, the question was, what made you come to Oregon, and when did you leave Levittown, which is where I grew up. I'd never been off the East Coast. And when I did my Peace Corps training, they did the Peace, it was like the third year there was a Peace Corps, and they really didn't know what they were doing. And we did our Peace Corps training for Liberia, West Africa, and San Francisco, which, if you've ever been to both, it's like, training for the moon, and I don't know, we're in Oahu or something. It's really nuts. But I'd never been, like I said, off the East Coast, and I remember the first day walking around San Francisco and say, oh my God, it's a big city and it's clean. It was really beautiful. So, and then I went to Africa where they had trees, which I'd never seen. So I decided I'm going to go back east for law school, but as soon as I get my working papers, I'm going to get the hell out. And fortunately, I got a clerkship with the Chief Judge of the Court of Appeals. I'd never been to Oregon. And my wife and I had to look it up on a map. We didn't know where it was. I thought it was like the Yukon. I thought you had to get around with sled dogs and it was snow and everything. So we came out and we just fell in love with the place. And I lived, on and off in Levittown. I mean, I was in D.C. for undergraduate and then came. But when I left New York, that's in the 1970s when I officially left the East Coast. Well, my folks still lived in Levittown. So, yes?
I was curious, how long it took you to get an agent once you decided to start writing?
For those of you who are interested in getting agents, this is absolutely useless. This is the bizarre story. I love telling it, but it's absolutely of no use to anybody. And it usually depresses people who are trying to find agents too. So I started writing Heartstone. And as I said, I had no idea. I didn't know what an agent was. I didn't know what you did with your manuscript. I'd only had the one writing class, and that had been years before. And I had 5 chapters in an outline when I get a call out of the blue from Marty Bauer. Marty was a friend of mine from law school. We roomed next to each other our first year, and then we both went nights our second year, and he was in a couple of classes, and I lost track of him. I moved to Oregon, he stayed in New York, and he calls me up and says he and his wife wanted to come out to Oregon on vacation. Could we get together? I said, hell, you can stay at my house. I said, I'd love to see you again, and I'll take some time off and I'll show you the gorge and Mount Hood and everything. So on the way from the airport, I pick him up at the airport. I asked him the question you would ask anyone you hadn't seen for 4 or 5 years. So Marty, what have you been doing? And Marty said that he was one of 3 lawyers for the largest literary agency in the world. And I said, Marty, I'm writing a book. And he said, oh, shit. And he started screaming and started to claw his way out of the car. No, actually, he was very nice. And I explained to him I had no idea what I was doing. I had never had any writing classes. I said, could you take my 5 chapters and just, I didn't know any authors either. Could you show this to someone in the agency and have them call up and say, hey, this is fabulous, continue, or it's really awful, stop. So Marty takes it back to New York, and I forget about it. And he's back there, and I'm back trying cases, and I'm in trial one evening, and we recess about 5 o'clock, and I come back to the office at 5:30 or 6, assuming everyone would be gone, but they were all sitting around with champagne. So I said, "What happened?" I thought someone won a big case. He said, "Well, your agent called," which I didn't know I had one. Marty, without asking me, he liked the chapters, so there was an apprentice agent. This is a guy who wasn't even an agent. He'd been a secretary to an editor of pocketbooks and decided he didn't want to be a secretary, he wanted to be an agent. So he, answered the phone for the real agents and brought them coffee, and they opened the mail. And he says, "My friend in Oregon wrote this, see what you can do with it." And the guy got the bright idea of calling up his old boss, and the old boss at Pocketbooks liked the 5 chapters, and I got a book contract. So that's how you do it. You go to law school, they're really friendly. I would start taking your LSAT test tomorrow. And so, but like I said, it's a great story, but it's totally useless for anyone who's real serious. But yeah.
Remember the names of all the books you wrote?
Probably, I'm getting, onset dementia.
Remember the last one I read.
Oh, okay, yeah, probably, if I had, like I said, it's 17. I've just finished number 20 the last week.
So
So
you find it easier to write a book and to address the locations in Portland because there's a lot of connection between.
yeah, I'm lazy. I mean, if I wanted to set it in, Omaha, I'd have to go to Omaha. This way I could just look out my window and I've been to Paris. If I could write it off, I would. I actually have a scene in Lausanne, Switzerland, which I was able to write off because I went there, and one in Jamaica, which I also wrote off of my taxes. But yeah. The Last Innocent Man was a HBO movie in 1987 with Ed Harris. It's really good. It was nominated for a whole bunch of. They didn't have the Emmys back then for cable, but they had the ACE Awards, and they got 6 ACE Award nominations. I had a part in it. It was phenomenal. I was a jury foreman. I had 2 lines. I should have gotten an Oscar nomination, but I was stabbed in the back. There's a lot of politics in Hollywood. It's really disgusting, and it really soured me on the whole movie industry. But and then Gone But Not Forgotten was a mini-series with Brooke Shields it was 2005. And that was actually pretty good also. They did a pretty good job with that. So I've been very happy with the 2. I've heard a lot of authors who hate the job that people do on them, but I've been really happy with the 2 that they've done. So, yeah.
What did you bring into the Dana Cutler novels and the Jaffe novels?
Why did I do that? Oh, okay, so the question was, why did I start the Amanda Jaffe series, which are 4 books, and then Dana Cutler, and there's my Washington trilogy, Executive Privilege, Supreme Justice, and Capital Murder, that have the same cast of characters, and then Sleight of Hand, which just has Dana. Well, it's an interesting question, because when Gone But Not Forgot was a mega hit. I mean, it was really huge. And so after I finished, I was trying to think, what will my next book be? And my gut reaction initially was to do another Betsy Tannenbaum serial killer book. Betsy's the heroine in Gone But Not Forgotten. So I was thinking, well, I should do that, start a series. But then I remembered Arthur Conan Doyle hated Sherlock Holmes. He couldn't stand him. He wanted to write historical novels. No one would read anything he wrote if it didn't have Sherlock in it. They go bananas. He even tried to kill Sherlock Holmes by throwing him off Reichenbach Falls, and the public went just absolutely batshit, and so he had to bring him back. So I was thinking, well, what if my second Betsy Tannenbaum is twice as popular? Then I would be stuck writing Betsy Tannenbaum serial killer books for the rest of my life, and I didn't want to do that. I wanted to, be able to write what I want to write, and I'd also notice some people pull off, but a lot of the series, they get really tired. You get a great plot and great characters in the first one, and then the plots start going down, and it's, is the heroine going to marry the detective she met in the last one? And so I thought, I'm going to take a chance and write something really different. And I wrote a love story. It's Beauty and the Beast with lawyers. It's got more dead bodies than Gone but Not Forgotten, and just as many twists and turns and surprises, but it has a whole different feel. Gone was a real scary serial killer book. So then I call my editor up, and I was a little nervous because I know that they like you to do series, and I said, I'm not going to write another Betsy. He said, great. He said, we don't want you to. We want Gone to be an event. We don't want it to just, be the first one in the series. So then I was hoping that if I wrote really good books, people would like them even if they didn't have a continuing character. Well, I wrote Wild Justice with my 7th book, and that's the first one with Amanda and Frank Jaffe, and that was intended to be a standalone. I wasn't going to continue it. Then I wrote The Associate after that, and I needed a criminal defense lawyer for the hero who gets arrested for murder, and I was going to invent one, and I said, gee, I really like Amanda Jaffe. I'll give her a cameo role. So she's about in 75 pages. Then I wrote Ties That Bind, and Ties That Bind in the original outline, the Jaffes weren't in it, but when I finished the outline, I thought, they would fit perfectly into this. So then the challenge was, could I continue the life of characters from a previous book? That was the challenge for me. Could I do that successfully? So I did. And then at that point, I realized I could just write some Jaffe books if I wanted to. And, so I did a couple of standalones and I did another Jaffe. So I'm sort of in a good position where I can do the series or not do the series, but there's not pressure on me to do the series. And then same thing with Executive Privilege, which was the first book in the Washington. That was supposed to be a standalone, but it was one of my most popular books. And the people at Harper said, can you write a sequel? And usually I can't write on demand. Writing for me is easy. Thinking up a plot that will fill up a 400-page, but that's really hard for me. It's unfortunate I have to do it once a year, but it's not easy. But I, for some weird reason, got the idea for the second book in the series like that, and then the third one, the second book, I take Brad Miller by coincidence, just by luck, I had given him a job as a clerk at the U.S. Supreme Court at the end of Executive Privilege, which takes place in the White House. So I thought, oh, he's in the Supreme Court, I'll write a book in the U.S. Supreme Court, and then those clerkships were only 1 year, and it was a recession, so I didn't want Brad to be unemployed, so I got him a job in the U.S. Senate in capital murder, so that's how that worked out. Yeah?
I want to expand on your comment about the difficulty you've had with coming up with a plot.
Uh-huh.
I've always been fascinated. What is the process of coming up with plot twists and weaving them all together and coming up with surprises?
Okay, I actually have a system that I do. The first thing is you get this idea, and the ideas are weird. They come from all over the place. You've heard Worthy Brown, and a couple of the other ones came from actual cases, but I was walking down the street in Seattle once, and I'll sort of walk you through this. Into my head pops the phrase, the Courthouse Athletic Club. Now, I have no idea why that phrase popped into my head. But I thought, that would be a pretty cool title for a book, but what would it be about? Well, what's a club? It's a group of people that get together to do something, and so is a conspiracy. And I'd never written a book about a conspiracy, so I said, well, maybe I'd write this book, it would be about a conspiracy, but what kind of conspiracy? Courthouse conspiracy. Maybe it's a conspiracy of lawyers and judges and policemen doing evil things. And so the next thing I do is sort of what you do for journalism class, what, where, when, and how. So the first question is, where is this going to be set? So you get your setting, Portland. Who are the people involved? Who are your characters? So you think about who these lawyers might be. Who would be the hero? Well, eventually I put the Jaffes in there because Courthouse Athletic Club ended up being Ties That Bind because nobody liked that title. And then you just start letting your mind wander. You say, well, what would this guy do? What would this situation? And you just, And what I usually do is I won't write a word till I've got the ending, because that's the most important part of any book. How many of you have read a book or seen a movie that was great and had a stupid ending? You know, what do you tell your friends? Oh, God, it was okay, but that ending was, you forget you loved about 90% of it. Flip that over, how many of you have seen a movie or read a book that was okay, but had a great ending? What do you say? Oh, my God, I just read this book. When I found out who the killer was, my jaw dropped. You forget 90% of that book was boring. So I won't write till I get the ending. And I think a lot. Executive Privilege, I got the idea in 1995 and didn't start writing until 2005 because I couldn't think of the ending. And I have idea files that I throw ideas in as I love the idea of could the president be a serial killer, but I couldn't just work my way through it. So and then once I get the ending and I've been stewing about scenes and characters, I do an outline. It takes me about 1 to 3 months to do the outline. And again, I'm not writing it all, I'm thinking. And I just try to talk my way through the whole book. So that's how it works out. Any other, yeah?
So I'm wondering whether you know whether lawyers read your books, and I'm also wondering whether you get any comments from lawyers on the legal process that you write about.
Well, I'm pretty sure lawyers do. I mean, I try to keep my books as realistic as possible. You know, if you did it like a real case, everyone would fall asleep. You know, used to do these 2-month-long federal drug conspiracy. Well, that sounds pretty exciting, right? Big drug cartel. You got guys sitting up there for 2 days. They're from the telephone company telling you going through the guy's telephone records. I mean, you could shoot yourself in the head after about 2 or 3 days of that. So I try to make things as realistic as I can, but I also keep in mind I'm writing entertainment. So, you know, it's a balance. It's a balance. Yes. Oh, let me get her. She hasn't asked a question yet.
In executive privilege, I was really kind of confused about Dana, how she was, you know, really a fierce girl and all, and had been through that tragedy of her own personal life, yet she was out. There was nothing, a discussion in there about the trial that she went through or how she was let off when she killed those.
Self-defense. There wasn't a trial.
Right, but it wasn't exactly self-defense. I think that's what threw me because, you know, yes, she had all those difficulties with those men doing all those awful things. But
Yeah.
I guess that was why she got off. I mean, for that time frame,
Yeah.
everything was surprised me.
No, she wouldn't have been. She under those certain. No one would have tried. For those of you who don't know, Dana is. It's a backstory, but she is undercover as a narcotics agent, in a biker gang, trying to find out where they're cooking, and they figure out who she is, and so they kidnap her and keep her a prisoner and torture her and rape her, and they make a mistake and let her. She gets out and not only kills everybody, but does it in the most hideous, horrible way imaginable. But then she goes to a mental hospital for a year. So she's never, no one ever faults her for chopping these guys up and shooting them. Yeah, I think if a rape victim was held captive for a week by a biker gang and was able to get free and kill them all, I think people would give them a medal. So I don't think they would no one would ever prosecute. Yeah.
Back to the court, one other connection. Jaffe, did you do with the Connells?
No, not at all.
Not at all.
The Frank and Amanda are father-daughter criminal defense team, but no. Yeah.
Asked to do a guest card game shot on Castle?
No. I have not. It would be fun. I have not. Yeah.
In the introduction, Robert said that you write books about the underdog and you're very interested and things like that. And I was wondering, why is that? I mean, Charles Dickens would write things like this in order to effect change.
Well, actually, maybe that was a misstatement, because I really write for entertainment. But I have a very strong, I mean, when I was in Liberia, I spent 2 years in a dictatorship where there was no rule of law. If the government didn't like what you did, they'd send the secret police and take you out in the middle of the night and torture you. So the reason I want to be a criminal defense lawyer was because of Perry Mason, but the philosophical underpinnings for why I did it was my experiences in Liberia. So I feel it's very important to give everyone a fair trial, especially the worst people. Because if you give Osama bin Laden or Ted Bundy a fair trial, everybody in the society knows that the system will work if they get picked up for drunk driving or shoplifting. And I think it's really the mark of a great democracy that we can give our worst people, the people that everyone would personally execute, a fair trial with representation. So I've always taken that part of the job very, very seriously. Yeah.
Said that this California lawyer eventually Supreme Court justice was the only sitting justice that ever murdered someone.
Was ever arrested for murder while on the Supreme Court.
So what did he do while he was on the Supreme Court? They got him arrested.
Oh, do we have time? Huh? Where? I'll just very quickly answer that, and then that'll be the last question. David Terry, the crazy judge who killed the senator, fell madly in love with this gold digger who was the mistress of a man who was worth $15 million in the 1850s. It was Bill Gates money. So what happened was that she thought when he died, he'd leave her money, but he didn't. So she forged a marriage contract. And Terry agreed to be her lawyer. And the case ended up in Field's court, because he wrote, the U.S. Supreme Court justice also wrote circuit in those days. So he had the Ninth Circuit. And when he ruled against them, the wife pulled the Derringer out and tried to shoot him in court. And she was wrestled down, and Terry dove in, and he was wrestled down. They were put in jail for contempt by Field, and they threatened to kill him. So he was given his own bodyguard. And just by coincidence, they were on a train, and the train stopped for lunch, and they were in this big cavernous area with picnic tables. And the crazy couple and the bodyguard were there. And there are a couple of versions of what happened. One version is that the bodyguard walked up behind Terry and shot him in the head. And he was very influential politically because he'd been Chief Justice, so even though he wasn't on the court, the wife ran to the DA and said, Field just killed my husband. So they were arrested, he and the bodyguard taken into state custody, but the feds found out and said, nah, can't arrest a federal official. Took them out, sent Field on his way, and eventually swept everything under the rug. So, well, listen, thank you very much. Now, am I signing? I'm going to be, if you want a copy of Worthy Brown, I am signing out in the lobby. But thanks a lot.